Busts and steals. On this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we talk about the imposters and the players who were the real deal but just didn't know it yet. From the past 2023 Fantasy MLR season, we reflect and break down the past year's draft, discuss where fantasy managers went wrong and where they went right as well. And of course, we go over all the latest news and notes from around the league. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 85 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. With you, as always, Matt Yee. I am Ryan Yee. Devin Vanderpool will hopefully be back with us soon. Again, scheduling changes has caused us to kind of flip things around here to try to organize when the three musketeers can get back together. But nonetheless, the show must go on. But Maddie, we had the Rugby World Cup going on over the past month. We've had our top fantasy player ranking reveal going on over the past couple months. A little bit of a slower time here for rugby, but nonetheless, there's still a whole bunch to break down on this Fantasy Ruckers Show episode. How you doing, man?
Hey, not too bad. And yeah, we're coming off, a little bit coming off of a high here with rugby events going on, but it doesn't stop here. We got the Gallagher Premiership on the Rugby Network Plus or whatever. I'm pretty sure that free month is coming to an end. So now somebody's going to have to pay. Unfortunately, that's not going to be me. I will continue to watch the free MLR matches on the Rugby Network, but I will not dish out money for the Gallagher Premiership. Nonetheless, European Championship Cup rugby starting. We're gonna get some, and we'll get into a little bit more. But we got the Super Rugby news coming in the next couple of weeks with some lineups being announced and some rosters being announced, and I'm sure we'll hit a slowdown. But right, it seems like we're still waiting on some big signings here in the MLR. That's keeping me at least on the edge of my seat.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to ask you a question, Matty. How is not having access to the Premiership gonna hinder our Fantasy Ruckers Premiership fantasy? If you have been following along, obviously we like to dabble in different forms of fantasy rugby across the world, and of course on SuperBrew.com we got the Fantasy Premiership going on right now. A little bit of a different format than what we do here on the Fantasy Ruckers, but nonetheless we've taken part in it, and we seem to be doing pretty well. But some of that might be attributed to the extra Premiership that you had access to.
Well, I'll be honest here. Some might call me not a true fan of rugby, but I haven't watched the Gallagher Premiership in about 3 years. So I'm a bit of a picky rugby fan, and I watch Super Rugby, NPC Bunnings Cup, and MLR. And those are the three that I stick with outside of international. So it seems like we're doing pretty well without watching Premiership. Seems like we're going to continue doing well, and Stephen Long can continue to suck it.
Well, I mean, that's basically your whole fantasy career has been just kind of winging it and hoping for the best. Didn't work for you so well in our first fantasy MLR season. Worked well for you last season. Maybe it'll pay off here for the Fantasy Premiership. But nonetheless, we got a jam-packed episode in this one. We said it at the top of the show in the teaser. It's all about the busts and steals from the past draft, the Fantasy Ruckers official league draft that happened earlier this year. Who are the imposters? Who are the ones that were the real deal? We just didn't know it yet, and we're gonna break that all down in this episode because this one is definitely an exercise that kind of revealed a lot, so you won't want to miss this conversation and how that's going to help you kind of navigate this world of fantasy MLR. And of course, we're trying to open up to the masses, so this is all useful information that people can use as they approach the 2024 draft. So it should be a good one. And again, no shortage of news and notes as well. Signings and trades continue to happen. We're going to break it all down. So again, it might be the off season, but it doesn't feel like it. I mean, it's been a flurry of moves, a whole bunch of MLR stuff going on, some exciting news, not really roster related coming out as well. It's a fun time here in the world of Major League Rugby, and translates to the world of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to that dead time in the holidays, but for now, like I said, we're still waiting on some things, and I think we're going to see some more flurry of signings, and I believe we saw some pretty big signings coming in around December time. So I know that there's a lot more coming for this MLR offseason, and we're going to continue to try and definitely point those out, definitely report on those, definitely talk fantasy about them. But I know that there's some big things coming, and I'm looking forward to it.
And one of those news that we're going to be talking about, a big news, has to do with the jersey that you're wearing there, Maddie. That Hurricanes jersey you're wearing. So, yeah, very, very fitting for this episode number 85. Well, before we get into it, I mean, like we say every single episode, if you're already, make sure you're giving us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers. Social handles are up above us on the YouTube video. For the podcast listeners, everything down below in the description. We've been saying it for a couple weeks now. I've been slowly working here with our mastermind behind our website, Alistair Kirschpool, Oddball Gentleman, AKP on Twitter. He's been our brains and brawn when it comes to the Fantasy Ruckers website. And we've been working hard, and we're inching closer to making this a real deal for everyone to take part in Fantasy MLR, not just our flagship Fantasy Ruckers League. So we're super excited about that. And as that continues to progress, when that does become available, you want to make sure you're following us on all those socials. Give Maddie a follow on X at Ye95, myself at Ryan J. Yee. And again, we have our Discord community as well down below in the description. And you can check out that website, thefantasyruckers.com, for what we used last year. And that will be the same home for what you will probably be using ahead when we do open up this to the masses. But let's hop right into it, Maddie. Again, there's no shortage of topics to cover here on this episode 85. Let's dive right in to the news and notes. Still, a flurry of signings and trades happening. And again, we'll break this down kind of team by team. And a team that has seemed pretty active this offseason has been the San Diego Legion, obviously falling short there this past year for that MLR shield against the New England Free Jacks, and they're continuing to try to make moves to get that step, to get that shield to the West Coast. But there's a big one here, and we alluded to it with the jersey that you're wearing, and I think not so much a signing and trade, but probably one of the biggest departures from Major League Rugby in recent while, and that is the departure of Richard Judd, scrum half for the San Diego Legion, leaving for your team, the Hurricanes.
For the boys, and I mean, look, it's a love-hate relationship here, right? I mean, I hate to see the fact that I'm not gonna be able to watch him and see him in the MLR and see him being an absolute stud for that San Diego Legion side. But I'm happy that he's going over to the Hurricanes. He's going to play kind of a reserve role to Cam Roigard. He's going to be a bit of a mentor for the young man. So it'll be good to see him. I'll still get to watch him. I'll still get to see him play now for my team, which will be good to see. But to talk about kind of the MLR, I think this is going to be a big hit for the San Diego Legion. I'll be curious to see what they do at the scrum half position. I know that Jason Higgins has had good games at the 9 position for San Diego Legion, but he's no Richard Judd. And I'm curious to understand what is kind of the impact here on Nate Augsburger's status, right? Like, Nate Augsburger is great on the wing, but he also was the reserve guy that often moved from the wing to the 9 position when Richard Judd came off the field. So
stop trying to sway people.
Well, hey, I'll be curious, but I'll be curious to see how this impacts it.
No, that's true.
I'll be curious to see, because if they don't sign any other 9, you're looking at Nate Augsburger and Jason. Who is the better 9 out of the 2? Yes, Augsburger is needed on the wing, and yes, he's a threat, but that could lead to more time for Augsburger playing at the wing or coming into that 9 position. And that means that less points for him ultimately, because he's just not going to score the same amount of points that he will have when he plays out in the back 3.
Yeah, you're just trying to draft him again as a scrum half, so he goes back on the back 3 and becomes your top point scorer for your team.
Look, we're gonna look 6 months down the line, and don't say I didn't warn you. Okay,
but nonetheless, though, you're right though. I mean, San Diego. I mean, a big part of their offense was the speed in which that they were able to operate, how quickly the ball moved from the breakdown, how quickly and high powered they could kind of flip the script and make big plays. And a big part of that, kind of turning back to Richard Judd, was Judd and his ability
Yeah.
to move so quickly from breakdown to breakdown, and be able to distribute the ball at such a fast rate, which again was a big part of this San Diego Legion offense. So yeah, definitely a huge loss for the San Diego Legion. Again, it's always encouraging and always great to see, because we understand that Major League Rugby is a stepping stone for a stepping stone league for players to kind of take that next step in the world of professional
Well,
rugby. And
yeah.
Richard Judd kind of used his time here. Was able to get a lot of playing time, and now has another big opportunity with the Hurricanes there to
I mean,
play
it's
that.
more, if anything, it's more like a reunion with the Hurricanes. He used to be with the Hurricanes, and then he came over here. He kind of lost his position with the Hurricanes, and now he's back. So, yeah, to your point, right? It was a way for him to almost be like, "Hey, I still got it. Don't
Yeah,
forget about
exactly.
me. Look at me. Look at me here. I still got it." And the Hurricanes clearly saw that, and the Hurricanes were watching, and now he's back.
Yeah, and Richard Judd was, again, a guy that finished atop of our scrum half rankings, and the top three there, finished as the third best scrum half from the 2023 season. We talked about him in depth in that scrum half ranking episode.
Mm-hmm.
105.7 fantasy points. Again, a guy that really did it all, and at that 9 position also racked up 96 tackles during our
Oh
fantasy
yeah.
MLR season, which is a pretty credible and not what you typically see from that scrum half position. But yeah, best of luck to Richard Judd, who's moving on back to the Southern Hemisphere, and back to his Hurricane squad, where he can hopefully make an impact in what we would argue is the best professional league in the entire world.
That's what I would say.
Absolutely. And then they made some other signings. Maitai Lueta is signing with the San Diego Legion as well, which is a nice addition. This is a guy that has MLR experience, played with the Hounds last year, played with the Houston SaberCats in 2022, 24 MLR caps during that span, 22 of them starts, scoring 4 tries. So again, kind of to add to the mix, you got another back three player that's high powered and has that athleticism. Obviously, a USA Rugby Sevens player joining the San Diego Legion, which should be interesting to see. And then as well, Peyton Talea Alalio is also joining the San Diego Legion, or re-signing with the signing with the San Diego Legion at that front row position. California native, 5 MLR caps for Austin in 2022. Again, another one of those guys, Maddie, that had played for the American Raptors in the South Americas, Super Rugby South Americas, and
Yep, the Solar.
the SLAR, and then now moving to back to the MLR, which is again an encouraging sign to see about that. The MLR is really making a name for itself and really putting the statement down when it comes to this America's side professional leagues.
Yeah, like I said, I think these guys were just tired of getting their butts whooped every weekend. So, as it stands, 1 MLR, 0 SLAR.
There you go. If everyone is taking count at home, Chicago
I am.
Hounds making a move. Tinashe Muchena re-signing with the Chicago Hounds. Again, not really fantasy relevant there. But let's shift on over to Old Glory DC's team. Some big signings here that did have some fantasy impact, and the biggest one here is Lataro Bavaro
Mhm.
re-signing with the Old Glory DC squad. I was actually a welcomed guest on Friends of the Show podcast. Alistair Kirschpool, as well as John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning, got to join their Glorious Rugby
Yeah, we got
podcast as a guest host there, and we went to quite some detail here about the signing of Bavaro. Yeah, we announced on Twitter that they traded my duties for 2 weeks here in exchange, I guess, for some stuff, but no salary cap
I
considerations
think we
put in
got kind of fleeced here, right? We got kind of fleeced. We should have at least, I mean, we've seen what salary cap considerations are being thrown away for. We could have got some of those.
Damn, I guess we just didn't value my hosting duties here as
You
highly
didn't
as we
value
did.
Ryan, believe in yourself, man.
There you go. Well, let's talk about Bavaro and talk about kind of the impact he had last season, what he's going to bring back to this Old Glory DC side. Lataro Bavaro, the second highest point scoring back row player for Old Glory DC, finished respectably among the top, I would say, 20 back rowers in all of fantasy. And he was a guy. You were dependable on him on a weekly basis. kind of had that low floor, had certain games. I mean, in round 9, scoring 23.1 fantasy points to add to that 108.5 total. Not a guy necessarily that you were putting in your lineup every single week, but definitely a guy that you could depend on if you're in a pinch to stream here. And now he's returning with Old Glory DC. I assume he's going to have another big role with him in that back row with Jamison Fontanana Schultz. Bavaro coming back to Old Glory.
Yeah, I mean, he was a consistent starter for that Old Glory DC side and was always able to make an impact on the field. Fantasy wise, like you said, it came and went, but it was hard pressed to not see him on a roster at least, because he was a guy that, you wanted to be there in case you needed to have somebody fill in, or maybe you needed to stream him on a certain week. He kind of fell, unfortunately, to the, Old Glory DC kind of downfall during the season a little bit. But I think he's going to be a big part of that Old Glory DC back row, and I expect a big season out of him this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you want a more in-depth, if you're an Old Glory DC fan and you want a more in-depth breakdown of the impact that Lataro Bavaro had, make sure you go check out the Glorious Rugby podcast, wherever you get podcasts. Me and Fitzy had a lot of fun doing that. And again, what AKP and what John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning do on a weekly basis with that show is excellent stuff, especially if you're passionate or as passionate as them, if that's even possible, of this Old Glory DC side. It's definitely a podcast to go check out. Old Glory DC also announcing the signing of U.S. eligible prop Kevin Brow, internationally capped for the Ivory Coast. Another just depth piece there for.
I was watching a big old conversation about whether he actually is U.S. eligible. So apparently he's not actually, according to Brian Ray, because of his participation with the Ivory Coast. I love Cote d'Ivoire, so in my opinion, great choice there, buddy.
All right, well, let's shift on over now to the New England Free Jacks, who also have been making some pretty interesting moves. And this one is one that we've kind of alluded to before when we were talking a little bit of Rugby World Cup about how these guys have been showcased on the international stage. And for some of these guys who are maybe looking for a professional job somewhere, it was a good chance for them to kind of showcase their skill set. And one of those players is captain of the Chile rugby squad, Martin Seagren, who is going to be joining the New England Free Jacks for 2024. He has professional rugby experience in the past, but now he gets to jump over to North America here and experience the cold of that Massachusetts area and play for the New England Free Jacks for this upcoming season.
Yeah, this will be interesting. I mean, we talked about the fact of how lethal that back row of the New England Free Jacks is. And now they have another, international caliber player added to that back row. So now you're looking at it and you're like, wow, like what's going to happen here fantasy wise? To me, that's it. That's a bit troubling because of how many back row players and options they have. Mm-hmm. Outside of Ian Conradi, I mean, you look at him as a staple, but we saw the effects of kind of Mitch Jacobson. I mean, Mitch Jacobson wasn't the best, the most fantasy relevant guy, even though that's what we expected out of him. So I'll be interested to see how this kind of impacts their back row and their kind of their depth chart, because that's going to be very fantasy relevant in how we select Martin Seagres or even Slade McDowell or even I think Slade McDowell is leaving, but or even guys like Mitch Jacobson to understand.
Joe Johnson, Ken Vidovitz, yeah. Again, just a busy back row room on that squad. And again, when it comes to fantasy, it's really a lot about opportunity, and we'll see where Martin Seagren is able to kind of slot in there with that back row room. And then just a few quick additions for 2024 for the New England Free Jacks. Kyle Bailey, again, a lot of these guys not really fantasy relevant. Kyle Bailey coming to the New England Free Jacks. John Roy Jenkinson and Jacko Bezenduet. I think that's how you say his name.
You tried your best.
I tried my best. Are all joining the New England Free Jacks as well. All forwards. We'll see how that kind of slots in there. Shifting on to the Utah Warriors, I'll just list all these out. Again, a lot of these guys really not fantasy relevant, but they signed Phil Bradford. Hooker coming on over, which is a nice one. He has experience in Australia, so we'll see where he kind of slots in for them as well. John Dupree, Sion Mahe, Jeremiah Noasi, all re-signing with the Utah Warriors as well. And then a couple departures as well. Connor McLeod, scrum half, is leaving. Logan Tago, back three player. Joey Back, front rower. And Connor Burns, who we mentioned earlier on the show, who was traded in a deal to Miami, is also officially leaving Utah there too. So just a few departures to keep an eye out for as well. Dallas Jackals making a signing. They bring in Ani Mateto for 2024, South African fullback. Played with NOLA Gold Rugby Academy in 2022. He signed with the Gold for 2023, and he's still hoping for that debut in the MLR. So maybe he'll be able to get that with the Dallas Jackals. And then this one a little bit more fantasy relevant as we shift over to the Houston SaberCats. Wow. Lourdes Vanderskiff is officially re-signing with the SaberCats for the 2024 season, potentially beyond that as well. Scored 12 tries in his 21 MLR matches for the SaberCats since he was a part of them from 2022. Lourdes Vanderskiff, I mean, he is very fantasy relevant. Had kind of more of a disappointing season this past year. Some of that had to do with injury. But nonetheless, when we saw him rolling at points, he was pretty dang good. I mean, he played 12 matches, started in 12 of them this past year, 112.1 fantasy points overall. He had explosive games. I mean, around 16 performance of 20.3 fantasy points as a whole. He has the potential to be a guy that's a starter for you in the circles of fantasy MLR. Just got to see the field, and at least we know now that he's returning to the SaberCats.
Yeah, it's good to see him back. We'll have to see. He's a guy that I'm looking at with huge caution. That's 2 years in a row where he has not played a full season for them. And I mean, you can say that he would be great if he played a full season all you want, but at the end of the day, if he doesn't, it doesn't really matter. So he's a guy that I look at with caution. But either way, it's great to know that he's still an option to take a shot on. And to potentially have a big breakout year this upcoming MLR season. Right, before we move on, though, Houston apparently, Tiana Rasmus was apparently seen in a Houston SaberCats golf shirt, but nothing was announced. So, things have been very quiet with this Atlanta squad that has died and has turned into LA. It seems like Tiana Rasmus has decided, hey, look, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to find my place with the Houston SaberCats. Not really too fancy rugby, but I thought I'd mention it.
No, and that brings up an interesting point because we have seen a lot of these announcements lately too in the circles of MLR where we're hearing about guys departing certain teams, and we don't have a clear picture on where they might be going or vice versa. Yeah. We see them kind of getting ready to join other squads and don't see any official announcement of them leaving a certain squad, which just begs to differ or lends the question, I should say, about how there's still kind of a shoddy communication standpoint. It's not as clear as it comes to other sports leagues. And I always question here, especially when I see some of these departures and things like that, like, is there a cut that's going on that they just want to be professional about? Are they just looking for other playing opportunities? It's not as contractually clear cut and dry as we often see in other sports.
Well, Ryan, the fact that we still don't know about what the heck this LA team
is,
true. I think says everything that we need to know about the transparency in the MLR.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift on over to the NOLA Gold. Just a couple more teams to get through here for this news and notes segment. The kind of fitting in that same space of showcasing talent at the Rugby World Cup. Another guy that appeared for Samoa in the Rugby World Cup is joining an MLR side, and that would be the NOLA Gold. Flanker OJ Noah will be joining the 2024 squad for the NOLA Gold. He's earned caps for Samoa in that qualifying campaign in 2023, and he joins from the Francis Top Pro side. So it should be interesting to see the impact that he has for the NOLA Gold.
Yeah, that's a great addition. I hope to see that we see Tom Florence back. I believe that he's already been announced as coming back. So yeah, that's going to be a great little combo there. Excited to see him. I think he's gonna have some fantasy impact this year, Ryan.
Yeah, and the Nola Gold have announced who will be leading the charge when it comes to that squad as well. We kind of alluded to it last episode. We were talking about that there was an incoming announcement shortly on a new coach for the Nola Gold Rugby Club, and it looks like it is going to be Corey Brown for the 2024 season. He was the Georgian rugby attack coach from 2021 through this year's Rugby World Cup. He's held roles with Connacht, the Highlanders, All Blacks U20, so a whole bunch of experience going to the Nola Gold from that coaching standpoint on a team that has a lot of weapons and had a disappointing last year, and they'll look to turn the page here.
Yeah, and I believe him and Kane Thompson would have either played together potentially, or they have a former relationship coming from the same kind of I believe Otago area. And Kane Thompson is staying on, but it'll be crazy to see that the fact that he brought Georgia or was a part of that Georgian coaching staff to lead them to beat tier 1 nations for the first time, Italy and Wales. Maybe he can bring these Nola Gold out of the gold mine and into the light, bring them out of the darkness and into the light. That's what he's there for. And hopefully he can do that for them.
That was good. I liked what you did there, Maddie.
Yeah,
I liked what you
nice.
did. And then what's a news and notes segment without announcing another Toronto Arrows re-signing of a Canadian international? Looks like Tyler Wong will be returning to the Toronto Arrows for the 2024 season. He earned 5 caps last year. And
he was a mid-season signing last year, right?
Yes, that is correct. And he will be coming back with the Toronto Arrows as well. Well, let's shift on over to some kind of exciting news here, Matt. Kind of some league news that has come out, and it looks like that the MLR is going to have a new kit supplier for at least the next 3 years, and that is going to be Kappa. Paladin has been the kit supplier for the MLR for the recent past that they have been involved. But I'm pretty excited for this. I mean, you're bringing in a notable brand. I believe Kappa, I don't know if they currently are. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, Maddie, but I'm pretty sure they are the kit supplier for Italy.
Yes.
If I'm correct. And this is a brand apparel that again is notable. I saw the kind of teaser video that the MLR released. I like the look of some of the kit. It's gonna be interesting to see how this kind of affects what the team's kit will all look like. But hey, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, a couple things here. I mean, I remember growing up and seeing their Kappa logo, the 2 ladies sitting back to back on soccer pants of all the soccer kids growing up. And, you knew that they were intense soccer players once you saw those little 2 girls sitting back to back. But look, Kappa, here's my message to you. All right, you've got a low bar. One, I'm glad that we got a supplier that is part of an international program that gives some reputation and puts us in a good space. But you are trying to beat a very low bar here, Kappa. Paladin could not get jerseys that fit with numbers. They couldn't even get jerseys to teams on time some of the time. We had guys wearing wrong numbers because they were too massive and too jacked. And you would think as a rugby jersey provider, you would, account for the fact that there could be some jacked people on the field. So there's a very low bar here, Kappa, and you just got to beat it just by a little bit. You don't even have to blow them out of the water, but just get jerseys that fit and jerseys that have the right number and allow teams to have jerseys that they can put on their players that actually make sense for the viewers. So low bar to beat. I mean, you just got to do it.
It was quite funny seeing Tuola Tasi on the Toronto Arrows not being able to wear.
I mean, Fabian Goodall's number was blank. That's what his number was all year long. Jeez.
Yeah,
but
we'll
hey,
see.
I'm excited, right?
Yeah, it should be good. I mean, I might have to go get myself a nice Kappa jersey.
And maybe we'll see some more unique designs of jerseys.
Yeah.
Maybe some less horizontal stripes. Maybe some, less Brooklyn Bridges on jerseys.
There you go. We'll see whether or not we can add a Kappa jersey here to the wall behind me. That'd be a lot of fun. But I'm excited.
Maybe some less gradient finishes on jerseys because we saw way too many of that.
There you go. They should just hire you on as a consultant, Maddie. I feel like you have a vision for
I've been trying to tell them, but
All right. And then lastly here for this news and notes segment, this is something that's obviously been in the books for quite some time, but it is just around the corner. And we know how important rugby in America and Canada really is. But I just wanted to remind our listeners and viewers that USA and Canada are set to take part in La Via International Rugby Cup that is upcoming. The first matches, I believe, are on November 11th. The reason why I bring this up is because this is a big deal. I mean, these are the first international tests, I believe, since there might have been a couple there, but since the heartbreaking nature of Canada and USA not making the World Cup there, this is some international competition to kind of put yourselves back on the map, and it starts with here. And I mentioned this on the Glorious Rugby podcast: is that you guys got to earn some trust back here with American rugby fans and Canadian rugby fans, and especially with the World Cup coming to home soil in 2031 for the men's and 2033 for the women's. We got to turn the table here, and it starts with this overseas tournament that is happening.
Yeah, and what I will say, it'll be a nice time to kind of see some of these MLR players, see what kind of form they're in, and watch them play for their nation. Unfortunately, I think we're just going to be watching Canada lose. The USA is probably in a better space, so who knows what they can pull out of the hat. But I'm calling for Spain to probably win whatever this thing is.
All right, I think that wraps it up for the news and notes. And Matt, do you have anything else that the people need to know that are happening around the league?
Yes. Well, so last week, I'm going to correct myself. Last week, I think I said that the Super Rugby teams would be announcing it in like the new year or something. Wrong, Matt. They're announcing their teams in the next couple weeks here. It was announced by the league, which I wish was a thing for the MLR. So MLR, take notes, because it would be great to have a formal announcement for every team so we can look forward to it. Like I'm counting down the dates for the Hurricanes roster, but in the next couple weeks, we should see some Super Rugby teams getting solidified, all their rosters being announced, which means after that, we should expect to see and have an inkling of maybe what players could be coming over to the US, what players could be coming over to the MLR. So don't be surprised if you start seeing some big New Zealand, Australian signings after, in December, pretty much.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's now shift on over to the meaty portion of this episode. We talked about it again at the top of the show. This episode is all about this past year's drafts, busts, and steals. Of course, we had our draft earlier this year before the 2023 season began for the official Fantasy Ruckers League, and it was an interesting one. Again, coming into it each year, it's always interesting to see the information that is available for us when draft night does come around. I believe we do have the live stream on our YouTube channel that you can go and scroll through on where players went and who got picked first, who got picked kind of later in the rounds, and how that all operated. It was a really fun night with all the people a part of our Fantasy Ruckers League. And then now kind of doing this and reflecting on, especially since we've just finished and wrapped up last week the back three players to kind of round off our top fantasy player ranking reel, to kind of look back and see where those top guys went in the draft, where guys didn't go in the draft, and even on some of our predictions, how that kind of landed maybe in this bust category, which, Matt, I know you're glad that we're over and done with. But it was an interesting one. And just to provide some context for how volatile this draft really is. And again, this is going to improve as we get more information, more data onto that fantasyruckers.com website, people making more informed decision as the leagues grow, as there's more information available to fans like us. I would only assume that this would kind of, minimize the volatility that we're seeing in these drafts. But to put into context just how crazy it is when it comes to fantasy MLR, no top 5 pick in our past Fantasy Ruckers League draft finished in the top 10 of scoring in the Fantasy MLR season. Only one player drafted in the top 10 actually finished in the top 10, and Matthew's taking his bows there for those who are listening on the podcast, because he was the one that drafted that singular player that we will talk about. That was JP Duplessis. Finished in the top 5 of centers. I believe he was the top scoring center all year last year, and finished in that top 5 of scoring overall in fantasy. Matt, the next best guy that finished in that first round from our Fantasy Ruckers League draft finished 23rd. So, I mean, that just goes to show you just how crazy and volatile this draft was. So there was a whole bunch of steals. There was a whole bunch of busts, and we're going to break them all down for the listeners and viewers now to kind of talk about it. And again, this was an interesting exercise. I think it highlights not obviously the players themselves are some of the key pieces there, but there's a common theme as you kind of work through these as well that made certain things apparent. And this is why I'm saying for people who are interested in playing fantasy MLR when it's available to you in the near future, to take note of this and realize that there are some common themes when it comes to certain positions that you might want to consider in upcoming fantasy MLR drafts.
For sure. And I'm going to throw a disclaimer out because, Rye, in the Discord, we love feedback as a fantasy
Of
Ruckers,
course.
right? We love feedback. And our boy Jay Payne kind of threw out some knowledge of saying, look, our stats don't include the playoffs. And we know people. So when we get into the stats here, when we talk about the steals, and I had a lot of them, and when we talk about the busts, we're talking about the fantasy stats here, the fantasy season stats, maybe, which doesn't include the playoffs, but just wanted to throw that out, right? Just to make sure any new listeners know exactly what they're hearing.
Yeah, no, and that fantasy season lasts from round 1 to round 17. Our championship fantasy MLR matchup happening in that round 17. So yes, those stats that we do have on our website are from those spans. That's a good note to point out there, Maddie. And then another thing before we get into these busts and steals that I want to mention is that I tried to avoid, especially when it came to the bus, guys who were significantly impacted by injury. We'll kind of get into the conversation more as we get into that bus segment, but I didn't think it was necessarily fair for guys who had like season-ending injuries, guys like, Sam Malcolm, Jack Hyden, who were really, really drafted high because there was high expectation, especially with the team that they're on and the amount of opportunity that they get. There's just unfortunate that they dealt with some pretty severe stuff that kind of limited them significantly in that 2023 campaign. But nonetheless, let's get into it. And let's start on more of a positive note here, Maddie, and let's get into the steals of this past draft. And I tried to do it in a way where I picked out a player from each position for each of these categories, just so that we can kind of highlight where guys went and how that kind of operated with these positions. And we'll start off by going over the front row position here. And we'll throw up the initial forward players here on steals here. But we'll start off here with the what I thought was the steal of the forward pack, I think, as a whole, was Sama Malolo. I mean, Sama Malolo was drafted in the Fantasy Ruckers League draft with the 8th pick of the 14th round, and he finishes off as the best front rower. We talked about him all season long, about what he was able to do, how explosive he was on that San Diego Legion offense, the meters that he was able to get from that front row position, which you often didn't see, especially in fantasy circles. That try-scoring ability as well, being a benefactor of that San Diego Legion maul, and he finishes as the 44th best fantasy player on the season. And to finish that as the front row player, that's pretty solid.
Yeah, that is pretty solid. And yeah, right. We talked about him every week, and he was an explosive force that always had the ability to break out. And surprisingly was able to break out through meters gained for a front rower, which is not something that we usually see, but we love to have. So yeah, undoubtedly, I'm not going to agree with you as the biggest steal out of the forwards, because I have another idea on that one, but I definitely think he's up there at number 2 out of the forwards as the biggest steal.
It was just fantasy production that you were getting from a position that really doesn't give that much fantasy production. Just having an edge every single week when you have Sam Malolo. I mean, it's kind of similar for those of you who play fantasy football, like having a top marquee tight end when you're facing a guy that's streaming his tight ends and really doesn't have anything. I mean, 122.7 fantasy points on the season. I mean, just to surpass 100 was difficult for a front rower to do in fantasy circles. He got 122. And you talk about meters gained, Matt, 751 meters gained on the season. To put into context, front rowers are typically averaging, I would say the average front rower, around maybe 5 to 6 fantasy points on a weekly basis, if he's having a good week, and you're not really depending on that try every single week. But you add Sam Malolo's try scoring ability, you add those meters gained. I mean, he had a season high 14.3 points in round 8. He went on a stretch for the first 4 weeks of the season scoring double-digit fantasy points. That's not even front row numbers. That you're starting to get into back territory when it comes to fantasy numbers. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff there for Sam Malolo. Shifting on to the second row steal of the draft. I got to mention him. I mean, heading into it, the thought was he was probably going to play the back row position because that's what he played over at Cal. And you probably, for those of you listening and viewing, probably can guess in your head who this is, and it is the rookie and the rookie of the year first overall draft pick from 2023. Sam Gala, drafted 11th, third pick of the 11th round in our Fantasy Ruckers League draft. Finished as the second row one, and finished even better than Sam Malolo at a position that is probably even more scarce than the front row position with that second row. Finishes 34th overall in the season. Sam Gala was incredible for you in 2023.
Yeah, what a surprise for us. I mean, we were talking about just questioning on whether he would get the opportunity in that team. And he definitely got the opportunity. And I know that he had some games, or he had like 1 or 2 games where he was at back row, but where we like to see him fantasy wise, we like to see him in that second row. And that's where he dominated. And that's where he was able to show the athleticism of a back row player, but also have the ability to make tackles and be that kind of force of nature at that second row position. So it was crazy to see the way that he operated this year. It was crazy to see a rookie finish as number 1 in a position, on top of some class guys in that second row list. So great steal for sure. Again, not somebody I have as the best steal.
Wow. I thought it was going to be forwards. I thought it was going to be Sam Gala for you, to be honest there. But yeah, 135.6 fantasy points on the year. I think the big number that kind of stands out to you from that second row position was he hit like a back row player. 203 tackles on the season. Only 1 match all year long did he score below double digit, or did he rack up less than double digit tackles. He was averaging around the 12, 13 tackles per match. He had a season high 19 tackles in round 5, a season high 15.6 fantasy points in round 7 at the second row position. I mean, again, kind of to that same sentiment, second row players are usually averaging your average second rower for fantasy MLR around maybe 4 or 5 points. This guy had the ability. He did have those low-scoring games, but he had also the ability to get you double digits. And again, that's a huge advantage for you in your starting lineup to have a guy like Sam Gala who's able to get you over those point totals over who you may be facing on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and I remember heading into the draft, we kind of talked about, maybe we don't touch the rookies in the draft. But I believe it was MLR All Access team that drafted Sam Gala, and it definitely paid off for them for sure, taking that risk.
Absolutely. All right, now let's and I feel like maybe this is the guy that you're alluding to as your number 1 steal. This is a guy, and obviously no bias there, because I know you were the one that picked him up here and had him on your squad and was part of your championship winning year. But Dallas Jackals, Adrian Boyson, to shift over to the biggest back row steal of the year. I can't even say it was necessarily a steal because it was just a freebie. Went undrafted, finishes as the second best back rower in fantasy MLR, and the 18th highest point scoring fantasy player overall in all of fantasy, and he went undrafted.
Somebody had to have the wherewithal and the knowledge and the intuition to drop fab on him after his
You
first
can't be talking
weekend.
about yourself then.
No, I am not. I'm talking about that great rock and roll fantasy manager. That guy, that great guy. Whether that is me, I don't know. But yeah, I see him as the biggest steal out of the forwards for everybody. He didn't go drafted. Nobody even picked him up before the first week. He has that explosive first week for the Dallas Jackals, a tackle machine, and just an absolute barrel running around the field. For me, this is the biggest forward steal of the draft, to finish 2nd and 18th overall. Second in your position, 18th overall in all of fantasy MLR, and to go undrafted and to be a staple of a championship fantasy team. That is, I think, to me, just a reason why he's the number one steal of the forwards in last year's
you're gonna throw
MLR.
My question is how long you're gonna keep throwing that in there. When is
when we're going through these steals, right? I mean, there's a lot of guys here that were on that team.
Well, to talk about Boyson again, 162.7 fantasy points during the fantasy season, started in all 15 matches that he played in. The big thing there was what you mentioned was with the tackles. I mean, I think there was a label with Boyson. There was concern when it came to the Dallas Jackals. And I think the same concern kind of circled around maybe Sam Gala as well. But Boyson didn't have necessarily that first overall pick rookie hype that came with him. But he had the tag of being a part of a Dallas Jackals team that had really no high expectation. the point scoring wasn't going to be there. How fantasy relevant was a guy as part of that squad going to be? But you mentioned the tackles, and I think this kind of highlights how at these positions who are able to rack up a lot of tackles, especially the back row position, there is a pathway to being very fantasy relevant, not just adequate, but more than adequate and an impactful player, I'll say it, on a championship winning team when you're able to rack those tackles up and you're able to rely on that, and you just have such a solid baseline. He may not get you, those 30-point Reichard Hatting weeks. You know what I mean?
Don't need him. He's on drugs.
But he's going to get you double-digit fantasy points on a weekly basis just because he's getting 15 tackles, 17 tackles. I mean, as a season high, 22 tackles in round 6. And even in that week, he still, he didn't really contribute, only had 21 meters gained, but he still scores 8.7 fantasy points. You know what I mean? So again, Boyson just had a really, really solid baseline for you. And he was able to do that consistently throughout the year, which got him up to that second back row position and to the 18th best overall.
And it'll be, I mean, for me, you look at a trend here for the guys when you're looking at guys on bad teams, don't get the guys that you need to rely on for points. Look at the guys that you can rely on to do the things that are going to happen in games for losing teams, regardless of how they're performing. They're going to need to tackle, right? They're going to need to hit the breakdown. And, breakdown steals and tackles are two things that can definitely be something that you can look at regardless of how bad the team is on. And it definitely, Rye, look at, these guys to fall in the draft or go undrafted simply because of the team that they're on, and be able to look at them and see those other stats and be able to potentially scoop them up and have a steal for next year.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift on over to the backs now, and let's throw those steals on the screen. And we'll start off with the scrum half position. Richard Judd. I mean, we talked about him and the significant loss that he's going to be for the San Diego Legion side, moving over back to the Hurricanes. But Richard Judd, again, one of those players, was on your squad, Maddie, undrafted.
I'm seeing a trend here.
Finishes as the third best scrum half in all of fantasy MLR, 76th overall in scoring at that scrum half position. Again, a position that really didn't provide a lot of points, but having Richard Judd was incredible. And I honestly, like, in hindsight, looking back at it, I have no idea. I have no idea. I have no idea how this guy went undrafted. We
slept on him. I don't know how I didn't include him in my top 5 rankings.
Especially being a Hurricanes fan.
Hindsight is 2020, but it was tough. I had to choose between him and Luke Campbell. They were both on the Hurricanes at some point. I liked Luke Campbell. Richard Judd, I didn't really love him when he's on the Hurricanes before, so that kind of swayed into it. But I will never let that type of bias sway me again, because Richard Judd was a stud. Judd was a stud. Dick Judd, the Chuds, the stud.
Yeah, nice.
But yeah, no, he was unexpected. I don't know. I agree. I don't know how he went undrafted. I mean, everybody, I think, was concerned with what does that look like for Nate Oxberger and Richard Judd? Like, how does that play into it? We didn't know Richard Judd was going to be the starting 9, and we didn't know
Nate Oxberger was going to play back 3.
Exactly. At least from our knowledge. I'm sure some people smarter than us inferred it and probably knew it, but for us, and clearly anybody who was drafting didn't think that was going to happen.
Sure.
But yeah, Richard Judd, we talked about it enough. He was unbelievable. And another guy who is able to, I think, do it in ways that is not typical to their position, was able to do it in ways similar to Sam Malolo. You don't expect 9s to make tackles, but Richard Judd, like you said earlier in the show, right? He made tackles. And whoever was that smart guy that picked him up out of waivers and dropped some fab on him.
And you know what? I'll give you your flowers. It's not a coincidence that 2 of these steals, both who went undrafted, was on your championship winning team. And I think that just goes to emphasize that there is a game within a game when it comes to fantasy MLR. It's not just about drafting the best players. It's about being knowledgeable about the league. It keeps you involved, knowing what's going around and the positions and the starters and the rosters, and making those quick pivots throughout the season, right? And I think this is a sentiment that's brought up in a lot of different fantasy sports, is that a championship is not won at the draft. It is about the moves that you make through the entirety of the season. And those 2 guys that we mentioned, the Boyson being undrafted and finishing where he did, and here Richard Judd being undrafted and finishing where he did. Again,
And
that was value you were getting for free,
yeah,
and you were able. They were instrumental parts of your lineup moving forward, and
for
again,
sure.
it was big.
And I think Richard Judd, when we're talking about the no, I'm not going to name him the best back steal of the draft. I don't think
Okay.
we're there yet. But
I know exactly who you're going to mention.
As we move on to the next position, though, you talk about building it through the waiver, but also when you can do both, when you can draft steals
Oh
and
my
pick
God.
waiver wire
I don't
steals,
think I
we
can
move
get
on
through
to
this
this fly
episode.
half. We move on to this fly half position, right? Who was it? Who drafted this pesty guy?
It was once again your very own Matt Yee drafting this fly half steal of the year in Jason Patros, drafted in the first pick of the 8th round, finishes off as the 3rd best fly half. We saw so many fly halves going early, and going off the board. The likes of Rodney Iona going earlier, a bust name that we're gonna bring up, Jack Hyden, Sam Malcolm going in the 1st round again.
Luke
A lot of that
Burden.
due to injury. Yeah, Luke Burden. Just so many guys. AJ Alatimu going in that 1st round, and for you able to get your starting fly half, a position that is probably one of the most important in fantasy circles because of their kicking ability. When you designate the kicker, it's typically going to be your fly half. Getting Patros in the latter half of your Fantasy Ruckers League draft, incredible. And he finishes off as the not only as the 3rd best fly half, but the 16th best player in all of fantasy.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that Jason Potros will fall again like this, just with the way he played last season and the fact that he's on the New England Free Jacks, right? So, it'll be interesting to see how he performs next year, if he's coming back. And yeah, I think this is just circumstance, right? Like he happened to fall because there was uncertainty around who would be the starting 10 at the New England Free Jacks. They had Reese McDonald, and they also had Jason Potros.
Well, talk about your strategy.
I panicked and picked both of them. Let's be honest with the people, Ryan. Let's be transparent, okay? They can go back and look at the tapes. I panic picked both Jason Potros and Reese McDonald, and it just happened to work out for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, Potros, I mean, the nice thing was the fact that he was reliable off the tee, and you can rely on him as a kicker. And the fact that New England Free Jacks were putting up points, you could always know that he was going to get the opportunity to kick some points through. Yes, he had some big games where he was able to get some try assists, but I think the fact that he was able to kind of rack up points off the tee, that was pretty big.
And I think that's what you're looking for at a fly half position. Again, this is kind of that sentiment and learning about these positions as we kind of go through them. And I mean, 8 conversions in round 9 for 21.3 fantasy points. That's incredible. It scores 168.6 on the year. And it highlights this fine balancing act that you have to do with certain positions, because again, I think the kicking opportunities and the point scoring opportunities you're going to get is based on the team that you're going to be on. Was it a coincidence that Jason Patros, being on a high scoring and a high powered New England Free Jacks team, was able to score the points he did? He may not be better. I can confidently say he's probably not a better player than a guy like Rodney Iona, right? But Rodney Iona is on a NOLA Gold team that struggled throughout the year and just was not able to get the same point scoring opportunities that the New England Free Jacks did. Not to say that Jason Patros isn't a talented player, but again, that fine balancing act of trying to figure out opportunity versus skill to have that comparison. I believe Rodney Iona went in the 3rd round, I want to say, of our Fantasy Ruckers.
I mean, even compare him to well, I guess, compare him to Tito Diaz-Bonilla, right? Like compare him to guys like even though the Seawolves were great, even comparing to AJ Alatimu, New England Free Jacks were just a force to be reckoned with for those last 11 games, right? So, and Potros benefited from that perfectly. I mean, he could have been a fly half one if he wasn't so allergic to tackling, and that's just a genetic issue, right? Like, there's nothing he can do about that one.
There you go. All right. Well, Patros, again, fly half steal of the year. Let's shift on over to the centers here. For the center position, this one's, I think, and it brings up an easier conversation here, because I think, surprisingly, out of all the things that were volatile in Fantasy MLR's drafts and in the Fantasy Ruckers League draft, the one thing that was pretty consistent was the center position. I mean, people were pretty solid. Even if it wasn't giving you back necessarily high value, it wasn't like they fell off completely and weren't getting you any points. Like, we're talking about guys like Leroux Milan, who's drafted in the first round, obviously dealing with that injury at the start of the season, but he still performed for you. You picked JP Duplessis in that first round. He performed for you. Mark O'Keefe in the second round. Billy Meeks, who fell a little bit because of visa issues in the third round. They all still performed. So no center really dropped off. So I think there was a lot more confidence going into it, which, again, this is about the things that you're learning. And I think your safe bet for those early picks is going to be these types of positions, the center position that has the consistent floor, the back row positions that have that consistent floor, and maybe not so volatile and so dependent on the team that they're necessarily on. And a guy this position, I think you're gonna. But then again, Dan Creel wasn't selected until that third round, and he finishes off as the second best center overall, the fifth best player. And I think if you're getting a top 5 player in the later third round, you can't not say that's a steal. I mean, you got the 5th best fantasy player in all of the league.
Yeah,
almost in the fourth round.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that logic there, especially the fact that we were kind of stating that centers should be going early, right? Like, we knew that centers were going to be the bell cows and the bulk of your production and where you could get a lot of that consistent performance, like you said. And the fact that a guy like Dan Creel fell to the third round was just crazy to see. But I mean, we've talked about Dan Creel a lot, so I don't want to go into it too much. Another guy that maybe we should look at, Rye, is like, what about a guy like Jordan Jackson Hope, a guy who goes undrafted and finishes as the 5th best center? Yeah, he doesn't like. He has 155 points, pretty far off from the 200 points that Dan Creel put up. And I still think Dan Creel is a better steal. I just think, there's so much depth at center that you look at, and it's like so many steals that we could have chosen from. Like, even Mika Kruse is almost a steal at some point.
Yeah.
Even though he played a lot of time at back 3, but didn't get drafted till late. So it's crazy with the center position. I feel like there's a lot of steals that we could have chosen from.
I think what this kind of outlines and what picture this paints for 2024 is that I think every single center is going to be drafted higher than they were in 2023. I think there's going to be a lot more dependence, a lot more confidence in these types of picks. And yes, maybe you're missing out on an explosive Ed Fido pick if you were drafting in 2022, or an explosive Joe Mono pick potentially for this 2024 year, or Nate Oxberger pick in this 2024 year. You might be missing out on a guy that's going to be able to put you ridiculous points, but you're not risking as much, and you're more confident in that pick who's going to at least not fail you. You know what I mean? He may not live up to that top 5 pick standard, but he's not going to burn you like some of these other players did in this first round. And you're still going to get value, and it's not going to be an end all be all. So again, Dan Creel, 200.4 fantasy points, like you mentioned, Matt. A big part of it was just the consistency. He was, I think, a poor man's JP Duplessis in a way. He just was able to get you double-digit fantasy points every single week, and was able to occasionally spur in the 17-point, 18-point, 128.5 per point performance in round 11. So again, Dan Creel for me, biggest steal. But I think, there's a lot of center names that you can put on this list. And I think, again, what it just emphasizes that centers is going to be holding a lot more value moving forward. And we mentioned that. That's the one thing that we predicted well, Matt, that centers were going to be the bell cows of fantasy MLR. And it appears that it's going to be the case in 2024. So we'll see whether or not we're proven differently there, but I think I can confidently say that centers will be bumped up in value heading into this next year. A lot of steals when it comes to this next position, back 3, and I think this is kind of the opposite sentiment of what we're talking about the centers. There was just so much volatility in this back 3 position. It was so difficult to be able to pinpoint what teams were going to be so high powered, and more importantly, which players were going to benefit the most from those high-powered offenses. And I mean, the steal, I would say this is probably the biggest steal in all of fantasy MLR this past year, was Joe Mono, our number 1 scoring fantasy MLR player of the season, when drafted in the 9th round. He finishes off as the best back 3 player, and like I said, the best fantasy MLR player. Joe Mono, what he was able to do was incredible this past season, 246.7 fantasy points in the 14 matches he played and started in the fantasy season, 14 tries, 5 try assists, over 1,400 meters gained. I mean, he went on a stretch between rounds 13 and round 16 where he was scoring over 20 fantasy points. He had a season high 35.6 in round 6. The issue is, and what's so hard here, and it is going to be the steal of the draft. I can't not question that. But trying to chase this for 2024 is going to be so difficult. And that's why the sentiment with around the centers is growing, at least in my mind, more and more, is because you could get burned. And this is going to be similar to one of our busts that we're going to be mentioning here, who had a similar season to Joe Mono in 2022 and is why he went so high in 2023. It scares me. It scares me to try to chase these points. But then again, I look like the idiot as well when he's the clear-cut number 1 option, heading into 2024, and you don't pick him with the first overall pick. It's tough. But nonetheless, though, Joe Mono, steal of the year.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantasy, right? Like, that's just what you got to deal with a lot of the time. I think the way that you look at it, and I'm not going to get too much in, but the way that you look at it is like, understanding that, hey, hedge your bets. You know that back 3 is going to be volatile. You can take that shot in the later rounds, but you can also take a shot early to make sure that you might have a guy, or at least have a higher chance of having a guy. Like you said, Ryan, there's not much more else to add to that Joe Mono was just a beast all year.
And then the second probably just with the story that's involved with
I mean,
it.
the people have heard it, but like, I don't know if yes, he finished back the number 2 back 3. I think out of all these back 3s, out of Joe Mono, out of Inafuti, out of Nate Oxberger, Nate Oxberger sits at like the lowest out of those 3. Just in the fact that he was drafted in the 5th round. Yes, he was drafted for another position, and I didn't expect him to go this crazy at the back 3 and be that type of player. But I don't think his story is as crazy, or it's as much of a steal as Joe Mono and Inafuti.
Does he get drafted? Does Nate Oxberger get drafted in the 5th round if he's listed as a back 3 player? You know what I mean? Like, I think he gets drafted much later.
Oh, I argue the other way around.
Really? Okay.
I think he gets drafted much earlier.
Okay.
I think you look at his pedigree as a player. I think the fact that he fell to the 5th round was that people thought that he was playing as a 9.
Sure.
And we didn't expect as much from him as a 9. And I see him as, if people were confirmed that he would be playing in the back 3 prior to the draft, I think he would have went higher and would have probably been drafted more appropriately, like in the 3rd round, maybe, to his position.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's all just about clarity. 228.7 fantasy points. Can't argue with that. 13 of the 14 matches that he started and played in. 9 tries on the season. 7 try assists. I don't think there's not anything much. We talked about Nate Oxberger a lot on this show.
We do.
I thought he was a pretty big steal. And then Matt, you mentioned, this guy's probably one of the bigger steals as well. Inafuti, the Seattle Seawolves, drafted in the 14th round, 3rd pick, finishes as the 3rd best back 3 player, finishes the 3rd best player in fantasy. Futi had an incredible season. 207.1 fantasy points. Started off a little bit slow, didn't have that starting position locked down. There was a talks and worries about Connor Mooneyham eating into that production. But as soon as he got slotted into that starting role, he was rolling. I don't even need to mention it again. 2 hat-trick try games, in round 13 and round 15. This guy was an animal, and he ended up tearing it up late in the season. That really, really just took him off.
To me, I actually see this as the steal of the draft. Like,
over Joe Mono.
To have the wherewithal and the understanding that, look, I'm going to take a flyer on Foodie, even though he may not even start. And he didn't. He didn't even start. Enough. And then he gets drafted in the 14th round. He gets dropped and picked up because the thoughts on him are so low. And then he comes and has the season that he has for the next 14 weeks or 13 weeks of the season. I see him as a steal of the draft just simply because of that. And simply because it was like, man, you had no idea what you're getting. And to take a chance on drafting him was courageous and risky, even though the guy who drafted him ended up dropping him. It was, the way that he ended up that season just shows like, and if I could get a guy like this in the 14th round, that's a good draft, and that's a good pick.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think again, a lot of these back three players could have been steals. There were a whole bunch of them on
Yeah.
this list that we could have popped up on. These were the three biggest one. But again, just highlights the volatility. And I will caution fantasy managers out there that I think there'll be some that are clear cut than others. I think you're going to be a lot more confident in picking Joe Mono than you will some other guys. But some of these back three guys may not be worth that draft capital going into the draft, despite the year that they had in 2023. You're just going to have to consider that. It's a lot less safe than some other positions as well.
Let me tell you this. You won't see me drafting a back three in the first or second round.
Okay. I mean, did you listen to the Glorious Rugby podcast? I told Fitzy that I swear that you didn't pay me to ask him this question. They do a off the cuff question at the end of the show.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked him if he had the first, or because we're going to get into the guy that he did end up picking first overall, who he would go with if he had the first overall pick this upcoming year. He wouldn't give it away. And not the information that at least you gave just there. He would let's shut. He would not give anything away, Fitzy.
Well, when you're a guy like Fitzy, and you think you know all the strategies, you think you know it all, right? You think you got fantasy rugby all worked out.
And then you destroy him in the semifinals
he's just scared of being wrong by announcing it too early. I'm transparent. I'm open with the people. I'll tell the people. I'll let them know how I'm going to do it. And whether I do it or not, that's for you to find out.
It's because you have that last place finish under your belt, so you have no shame.
I've seen it all. I've seen it all, people.
All right, well, let's shift on over to the not so fun discussion in this steals and bust conversation. But it is an interesting one, though, and let's get into some of these busts and start breaking these down on what went wrong. And we'll start off at the front, obviously the forwards like we did with the steals, and we'll start with the front row position. This one was a tough one, again, because I think a lot of this bust conversation is going to be surrounded by the fact of where we value these positions. Again, kind of like what we mentioned in the steals portion. But Dylan Fawcett is probably my bust of the draft. He was drafted with high capital, second round, 5th pick. He does finish off as your second front rower. But you look at that in the scheme of the amount of points that is being produced among all players, and you're finishing off as the 48th best fantasy player, and you're drafted as the 15th player overall in all of fantasy. Yeah. That's just tough. And there were so many guys there that you could have picked with that second round pick that you passed up on to hopefully get that advantage that you saw in 2022, with Fawcett being the huge benefactor of that New York Ironworkers scrum and that line out and that maul, and him scoring as many tries as he did in 2022. You just didn't get that here this past season, and you took a flyer on him. And if he was going to get that for you, he was going to be a huge advantage. He was going to be the Sam Malolo, right? He just
better than the Sam
Malolo, and he just wasn't that. Again, I got to give props to going with the pick. I can't say that at the time it was a wrong pick to make. It just burned you in the end, because Fawcett just ended up being another front row player that doesn't produce as many fantasy points at a draft spot where there was a whole bunch of more fantasy points to be had.
Yeah, and obviously, Dean Muir can't be on this list because of the time that he missed with personal issues. So it can't really play into this as a bust because we left those names out. And this was a tough one, right? I mean, this was hard to look at. You really had to find, people weren't valuing front row outside of the top 3 already that high. So it was hard to really look at a bust and find a proper bust. We kind of saw all the front row as low valued players. But I agree with you. We look at Dylan Fawcett, we look at the season he had last year. You expect a clear cut being the number 1, number 2 front row with Dean Muir above kind of where they were, like above this 120 point threshold, above where Sam Malolo was as the number 1. And he just didn't get it. And like you said, Rye, that New York offense and the New York performance just didn't play into his hand, unfortunately. And that's kind of where you saw it play into his bust ability.
And I mean, I'll throw in the Dean Muir conversation there as well. And the only reason why I know he missed time due to personal injury, but again, Dean Muir was drafted in the later parts of the first round. Again, kind of that sentiment that he was going to be such a big advantage for you to score the number of tries that he had in 2022. He was drafted in the 8th pick of the first round, but then you kind of extrapolate that out. And I get it. Dean Muir is a different player than any of these other players that the Houston SaberCats had on their roster. But you look at the front rowers on Houston SaberCats. It's not like anyone else had even close to the production of what Dean Muir had in 2022. So if you extrapolate that out, you're hoping for a high efficient line out maul that's going to get you so many of these tries. Houston didn't get that like they did in 2023, like they did in 2022. Yeah. So again, I would throw that bus conversation. Again, I think it goes back into the back three conversation, is that the front row is another position that those high tier guys, it's going to be hard to have confidence in that, especially moving forward now, seeing what you saw, to hope there's no clear cut pathway for them to produce that the way they had in the past. It's really so dependent on the team as a whole. I get it. Dean Muir and the Butcher and Fawcett are high level players. It's just so dependent on how well the team is, and it's not a coincidence that the struggles of the New York Ironworkers kind of extrapolated out to the struggles of Dylan Fawcett from a fantasy perspective, and he ends up not producing where you ended up picking him at. So
for sure.
Interesting. So, and then let's move on to the second row position, and I think to the sentiment about the center position, about how I think people were pretty good in terms of valuing certain guys and the value that they had. I think to the opposite extent, I think everyone outside of the steal that was Sam Galla, because he was just so different from the rest. I mean, you talk about what Sam Galla was able to do compared to all the other second rowers. I mean, Sam Galla was able to put 135.6 fantasy points. The other guys that even came close to them had back row eligibility. So they were also playing the back row position as well, which kind of inflates their point total. But the next pure second rower, the guy that we'll probably put on this list and hesitantly so, I mean, with the expectation that he had, Johan Mumsen, the second best pure second rower with 104.5 fantasy points. He wasn't a bust, I would say. He still gave you that kind of edge. Didn't give you the same edge that you got in 2022. But I think everyone knew that second rowers were just not going to produce for you point-wise. And it just lent itself for that to not really be any more bust, because second rowers weren't really picked early on.
Yeah, I would say that, look, Johan Mumsen being the first second rower off the board, you expect him to be the top second row in fantasy rugby. And he wasn't by quite a wide margin. So in that regards, Rye, maybe he is a bust. Maybe we do classify him as a bust just for the fact that, being the first one off the board in the second row position, you have a certain expectation that the fantasy manager, aka myself, is trying to make sure that you live up to. I don't think he fully lived up to that.
But you're not quite disappointed, though. I mean, drafted him in the first pick of the 4th round.
It's like a reach bust. It's a reach bust to me. Like we're reaching for something here, and maybe we don't have to classify players in this negative category. So let's just leave it empty, right?
There we go. All right, and then we shift on over to the back row position. Kind of the same sentiment. I mean, I think back rowers were relatively spot on in terms of where they went. I think again, it's not a coincidence that this was a little bit more of a dependable position and people a little bit more confident in picking them. I do kind of same way as the center position think that back row players will probably get drafted higher in this 2024 draft because of that confidence. So that will lend itself to there being more bust. But if I had to pick a name, I'd probably say Reichert Hadding. I know he had the injury that he dealt with throughout the year in some portions, but you're picking him in our Fantasy Ruckers League draft with the 2nd overall pick, and you're expecting something special when it comes to picking someone with that 2nd overall pick. When he played for you, he was great, and he gave you those numbers that you were expecting, maybe not as crazy as the numbers that we saw in 2022. finishes off as the 5th best back 3 player, and you're happy with it, he just wasn't available for you. So I can't put that against him necessarily, but at the same time, 2nd pick overall, you got to bake some of that into there, and you were disappointed with what you would have picked if you knew this was the season he was going to have, which I know is a big if. You wouldn't have picked him 2nd overall.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with everything you said there. We know my sentiment on Riker, but I'll throw somebody, another name. If we're going to throw Riker Hatting in there, shouldn't we throw in Hanko Gramicious in there too?
Sure.
Right? Like, yeah, we're not touching, but like back row again, we're just trying to find guys that we maybe can fit in this category. And I think Hanko Gramicious is another one. I mean, drafting the 3rd or 4th round, and then being the dud that he was by not playing, being injured. It was a tough year for him for sure, for the fantasy manager. When you use that 3rd or 4th round capital, that was tough. But you can't predict those types of things. And
And that's the thing, right? When I start reaching the 4th and 5th round, I'm giving the whole injury conversation a little bit more slack. Again, you can't predict injuries. You do need to bake it in. And if it becomes a consistent problem, then you can start baking that in with a little bit more confidence. But again, this being relatively new, a lot of these players being relatively fresh and having not seen necessarily a extended injury pass with some of these players, we'll have to see. But again, I think it's fair enough to kind of throw some of those names in this conversation. But for me, I think Riker Hatting, just because he was picked with the 2nd overall pick, has to go in that slot there. Let's shift on over now to the backs here and throw that up on the screen. This is probably would have been.
This is the biggest bust of the draft.
You think so?
I think this. Well, I think this is second biggest bust.
I think it's the 2nd. It's a big one, and it's very close. But this, if something doesn't picture the disappointment that was the Chicago Hounds season, and just the stark difference of the hype of this team going into the year versus how they finished off, this pick kind of shows that all. And we're talking about Luke Burden in our Fantasy Ruckers League draft. He was drafted with the 9th pick overall in that 1st round. Finishes off as the fly half 25.
Jeez.
And the 312th. Yes, you heard me correctly.
I mean, he hardly played.
The 312th player overall. And that's the question. That's the thing. And I think this lends itself to a different conversation where there was confidence that Luke Burden was going to be the starting fly half for this.
You know where that was coming from, right?
I don't think I have that much power.
Look, you're the voice of Fantasy MLR, Rye, and you were preaching over here saying that this back line with Luke Burden at 10 was going to be absolutely killer. And what happened?
I mean, it wasn't a terrible back line. It just wasn't Luke Burden. Luke Burden, if Luke Carty,
did you not realize that Luke Burden's last name was not Carty?
Maybe I got mixed up. Maybe we'll say it like that. But again, to what you were saying, Matt, he just didn't play, right? He didn't end up being the Chicago Hounds fly half. It ended up being Luke Carty. And it
was awful.
This
must have sucked. I mean, you're spending a lot of draft capital to have a consistent 10. And this one hurts. Like this one
you couldn't even play. You like some of these other ones, right, that were busts, like you were still gonna play Dylan Fawcett. You were still okay with him being your starting front rower, right?
Yeah,
you were okay with Johan Mumsen. You're okay with Riker Hatting when he was there for you. This one was purely unplayable. You drafted him in the 1st round, and you just could not start him.
And it was hard to drop him. You had to take some weeks to really be like, hey, is this really happening? Is something going on?
I changed my mind. I changed my mind. This is the bust of the draft. This is the bust of the draft. Now that I talk it out, I mean, 312th, Maddie. 312, and you picked him with the 9th pick.
The fact that he didn't play, that one's gotta hurt. That's like, it was basically like drafting guy first and then him getting cut right after. So,
and you know what? I get it. You know what? Great responsibility with great power. With great power comes great responsibility.
We're throwing out some narratives out there about this.
I wasn't responsible here, and I should be a little bit more careful. But I will say this: I was very confident that the fly half position for the Chicago Hounds was going to be a fantasy producer. I just got the wrong Luke put in there. And I apologize, and I particularly apologize to Hokie of the Dankest
Well,
Anchors who drafted him with that 9th pick in the first round.
look, Hokie dug his own grave.
There you go. Yeah, this one was terrible. This one was absolutely terrible. But nonetheless, I don't think much else needs to be said when it comes to Luke Britton. Why to just put the icing on top? I'll just mention his fantasy stats.
We don't have to. We don't have to because there are none. There are none. It's 24 points as a fly half, and
in his first appearance in round 10 as a sub.
Yeah. See, we don't have to. See, we don't have to go past that one. Let's just
that
go to the next. Let's go to the next bust.
Let's go on to our scrum half bust, and this one's an interesting one. And again, follows the same narrative. Another first rounder. Same narrative of I think there's going to be a little bit more caution when it comes to some of these positions. We talked about the front row. I think there's going to be a little bit more caution with the scrum half position, and I mean you can't blame it going into the season. Danny Tusitala, what he did in 2022. And the attacking ability that he had and what he did differently than all the other 9s in the league in 2022, it was going to be such a big advantage for you. It just didn't pan out. And he finishes off as the scrum half 5, 100th best player in fantasy overall. He ends up, again, a top 5 scrum half, it's good. It's just not worth the 4th pick in the draft. And you're getting weeks from him where he's scoring you 2 points, and that's not what you need at the 4th overall pick. Finishes with 90.9 fantasy points, an adequate scrum half. But I think if this doesn't define that scrum halves will not be going early in our drafts, I don't know what does. I think that they'll be late, even if it's a Richard Judd, right? Even if Richard Judd was staying, I don't think he gets picked in the first round.
What about a JP Smith?
I don't think JP Smith gets picked in the first round next year.
Yeah, I agree. But I think Danny Tusitala had the different thought that he would be the guy that would continue to be that attacking threat and have the freedom to kind of attack the way that he did in the 2022 season. He didn't have that. We saw glimpses of it. And we saw some flashes of that same Danny Tusitala, but that it just wasn't the same. So yeah, it was just unfortunate to see that. He had the playing time, he had everything. He just didn't have that same attacking ability that he had the year prior. So yeah, it was crazy actually, the fact that he went in the 4th pick.
Yeah. Nuts. All right, let's shift on over to the center position. This one, again, kind of the same sentiment with the Steels. No center, even if they were picked early, maybe they didn't live up to the expectation, but they did not disappoint necessarily to a great scale. You were still somewhat content, because I think compared to some of these other busts that we're talking about that literally just did not get you many points at all, centers were getting you points on a regular basis for the most part. Some names that we can list in here, I have listed Luritz Vanderskiff. Obviously, there was a lot of hype with what he was able to do in 2022, being able to translate over to this past year. Again, injury had a little bit to do with that. 112.1 fantasy points on the season. Misses a few matches here and there, but again, he still played 12 matches in the ones that and started all 12 of them. Scored 4 tries. Didn't have that same try scoring that you saw in 22. He was drafted with the second excuse me, let me count here. 8th pick, 7th pick of the second round. So again, I think he's a bust. He was okay, but again, there were obviously options that you'll look later at the center position that were doing way better than him.
Yeah,
put my money on it. I think Lawrence Vanderskiff is there.
But we look at the injury again. It's one of those things, like he was out with injury for a lot of the year, and I look at a guy like Tion Lutz maybe as that bust in the center position, because I mean he was drafted 6th, 7th round, I think, potentially earlier, and he hardly played. I mean, I don't believe that he was injured. He just did not make it into that lineup. And I could be wrong, but like that was my view of it. I also look at another guy like William Talatena getting drafted in I think the end of the 3rd round or the start of the 3rd round, and ends up being like the center position 12 or 13. And that's a lot of capital to draft a guy to get the 15th best center for sure. And that's with that, and he played all season, which is kind of even more disappointing as well. Like you have him, yes, you can play him, but that's not what you use your 3rd round pick to get.
Right. And we completely understand that a lot of this, or some of this, has to do with the information that is available.
Yeah.
We didn't know that Luke Burden wasn't going to be the starting fly half. You didn't know that Tian Lutz wasn't going to be even considered in the lineup. You know what I mean? And
but that's fantasy though, right? Like I think yes, you can have inklings of, hey, look, we think this is going to be the starter. But you even look at other fantasy sports and it's like, whoa, this guy ends up on the bench all year long and hardly gets any snaps. Or this player is getting only 50% playing time versus the 100% or 90% that we expected them to get. I think that's just fantasy. And that's just, we're going to have busts every year. And we're going to have busts, maybe not to the extremes of this, and everybody will learn. But I think this is just fantasy being fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, and then talk about fantasy being fantasy. Let's wrap up the bus with probably what we were, before we went through our Luke Burden talking session, what we probably consider the biggest bust of the draft. First overall pick.
Oof, rugby morning.
Ed Fido.
Fitzy.
Doesn't give you Ed Fido numbers. I mean, again, I can't blame him. Ed Fido was doing incredible things. Again, like I mentioned earlier in the show, Ed Fido in 2022 was Joe Mono in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so hard to not take him with that first pick. You can't blame him. But at the same time, he finishes off as the 11th best back 3 player, the 23rd overall in fantasy. It's just tough. It's just that it's that number 1 draft capital that is going to be. There were just so many options. Again, you probably weren't looking elsewhere. I did have a conversation with Fitzy, and he said if the news about Billy Meeks had not come out and he knew that Billy Meeks was starting with the first pick, he would have picked him first overall. And honestly, he probably should have went with Billy Meeks in the first overall, despite him missing the first handful. Yeah, he still finished higher than Ed Fido in fantasy circles. So at a position that was probably harder to find. And he did end up getting him in the 3rd round, so I guess the argument is null. But man, that is tough for the first pick. And that's why last episode I mentioned to you, Maddie, I will hate if I'm a fantasy manager that has any of the top 4 or 5 picks, I am going to be sweating and I will not know what to do with it.
Well, right, that's why you're not a fantasy manager. Because if you can't take the heat, you stay out of the kitchen, right, bud?
I create the kitchen.
Oh, yeah, but you can't handle it. Can't handle your own creation. But yeah, no, this was a tough one. I mean, to go first overall and to get that type of performance, and it's not even like, and to reiterate something that we said, it's not like he did bad. Right. It's not like you couldn't play him. It's not like you couldn't start him. He just was not 1.1 first pick overall caliber that you expected, especially when you have certain expectations of him himself as a player. This was a wild one to watch because you were just kind of waiting to say, oh, this is the breakout game. This is the game where he breaks out. And then he has a dud week. This is the game where he breaks out. Then he has a dud week. And once you kind of saw that the Rugby New York Ironworkers just weren't going to include him as a staple part of their offense like they did in the past, that was kind of it for him. And it was unfortunate to see.
Yeah. And I mean, what makes it harder too was just like there were other players and a lot of it, again, has to do with the expectation that the New York Ironworkers had going into the season and just how disappointing of a 2023 it was for them. Mm-hmm. But what was more concerning was that there were other back 3 players on the New York Ironworkers that were producing better than what Ed Fido. You talk about Andrew Coe, who finished, I believe, 13th overall with 168.8 fantasy points. You would have been happier with him with the first overall pick. And not that wouldn't have been a bust, but it's just scary to think that it was this far off. When there was so much expectation around it. Again, this is not an attack on Ed Fido as a player. I think what we're learning is that the back 3 position has a whole lot to do with the caliber of the team and the way the team is performing. And again, that's going to lend itself to, I think, and I will wrap up kind of the bust segment and the steals and busts conversation here, is that I think going through this exercise, what it really highlights is that I think, as a fantasy manager in my first round, I'm going to lean with players who I am confident in, regardless of what the outside circumstances are, what team he's on, what offense he's a part of. As long as I know the opportunity is there and he is filling up stat sheets that aren't dependent on a team being successful, that's the player that I'm going to go with. And it's a tough conversation to have because you might miss out on next year's Joe Mano, right? You might miss out on a Nate Oxberg or a Liana Futi. But again, kind of how I've been alluding to all episode long, you're going to be a little bit more confident in that pick. And this goes to show you that you can find a Joe Mano later in the draft and base that around a player that is going to perform for you and not burn you as badly as an Ed Fido did or as some of these other busts did. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think this conversation completely changes the shape of how people are approaching the 2024 draft.
Yeah, it definitely makes you more concerned with your top picks and who you're going to take. But at the end of the day, I think people are going to strategize the draft the way that they want to. If they, if they value getting the top hooker and finding the top front row is important to them, and they think that, hey, look, if I can get the front row that is scoring 40 points more than the rest, I'm going to go for it in my first round. Take that risk. I mean, go for it, but it might cause a lot of fantasy managers, Ryan, like you said, to kind of change and say, look, I want to go for the position where I can have the highest chance of hitting. I want the highest chance of being able to make sure that I'm not picking a bust in these first 3 rounds. If I pick a bust in the 4th round, sure, so be it. But if I pick a bust in the first pick, with my second pick, with my third pick, yeah, my team's going to be in trouble.
And I mean, to play devil's advocate, I mean, I get it. You might miss out on a championship winning player like a Joe Mano at your top pick. But I think what this also highlights is that I think championships can be lost in the early rounds when you get burned by an Ed Fido or a Danny Tusitala or a Luke Burden. Where the championships are won is in those later rounds when you're picking a Nate Oxberger or a Joe Mano or a Jason Potros in the later rounds. And I'm not saying that you're going to be able to find and luck out as well as getting the number 1 fantasy player in all of fantasy for 2023 in the 9th round. I don't think that's going to happen, or the likelihood of that happening again is very, very low. But again, it's getting the 3rd best fly half in the 8th round. It's about getting the 2nd best back 3er in the 5th round. That's where you're going to win these championships. So it's all about roster construction. And maybe you do go with a Joe Mano in the 1st round. You just know, and this would be my advice, is that in your 2nd pick, you need to then pick a guy that's going to be consistent. You can't pick all upside. There has to be some mix of upside and consistency in there. But again, fantasy managers will do with what they will with this information. And
somebody might take your advice, right?
Not after the Luke Burden pick. No chance.
Won't be me.
Interesting one though, Matt. I guess overall, as we close up the show, what did you learn? I know I've been spitting about what I've kind of taken from this, but overall, kind of what did you learn from this bust and steals exercise here?
Yeah, I had a lot of steals, and not a lot of busts.
Get out of here! All right, we're gonna close the show there.
No. But seriously, I think it's a similar sentiment to your point. I think it just shows exactly how volatile and just how brutal fantasy can be, and that you have to be able to accept some of this risk, but also, you have to do your part in trying to minimize the risk that you have here. Like minimizing, all right, if I take this chance here, how much risk am I taking that he might not do well? And what is my next option to cover, or as we like to call it, Ryan, in the fantasy realm, to handcuff this pick? And you got to be thinking of that as a fantasy manager. And you got to be thinking that, especially while we understand that, I mean, you said that it might not happen again, but we don't know exactly if this bust is going to be a regular. Like, we've had this 2 years in a row or this is the first year where we've really had these stats and kind of saying, like, we don't know if this is a trend, whether we're going to see these busts every year, whether this is going to continue to happen. So you got to cover yourself for that and make sure that you're prepared if that were to happen and that your team's still not absolutely doomed.
And what I'll finish with a note kind of to the sentiment is that even if you do end up picking a Luke Burden bust or an Ed Fido bust in the drafts, again, that's not where the championships are won. You talk about some of these undrafted players in the Steelers. You just got to keep an eye on, and you got to make moves. You just got to be extra diligent and make those moves during the year that are going to kind of go there.
Take it from the man himself, Fitz. Ed Fido at 1 doesn't feel like such a bust when you got Joe Mono sitting on your bench.
That is true. That is true. That is true. All right. Well, again, really interesting kind of exercise there. We'll continue to bring you a lot of this interesting content and fantasy MLR related tips, tricks, and conversations throughout the offseason here as we slowly inch towards the 2024 year. Couldn't come any faster. I mean, I cannot wait. I cannot wait for the 2024 draft to come and for us to establish the baseline and create another crazy Luke Burden what's it called? Luke Burden, what's the word I'm looking for?
Bust.
No.
Awful choice. Awful opinion.
Sure.
Brutal.
Sure. None of those mantras there. But anyways, going to be exciting. 2024 is going to be a great year. Hopefully you're able to take some things away from here and help you prepare closer to your 2024 draft. And again, all tidbits that I hope everyone can use as we expand this to everyone in fantasy circles to enjoy fantasy MLR. For Matt Yee, for myself, we'll be back here again on the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
Fanny, you pig.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.